After the end of World War II, the Soviet Union began to prepare for a new military clash. Only this time with the countries of the North Atlantic Bloc, and it was not a far-fetched threat. In the summer of 1945, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill was developing a plan to invade the USSR, but British analysts did not allow him to invade the Soviet Union. And soon there was a new threat of nuclear war. That same year, 1945, the Americans tested their nuclear bombs on the Japanese in the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In the Soviet Union, the first nuclear bomb was successfully tested in 1949, and in 1954, the Soviet leadership decided to conduct an exercise using an atomic bomb. The project was codenamed Snowball. Marshal Georgy Zhukov was appointed commander of the tests. The Totsk test site, located near Orenburg, was chosen as the venue. Already in the 90s, after the USSR ceased to exist and this project became known, Western and Russian media began to say that Snezhok was aimed at studying the effects of radiation on people. However, in fact, Snowball had quite different goals. The main objective was to determine whether troops in a nuclear war could withstand the enemy's defenses, and also to observe what happens to those who are in the epicenter of the explosion. No humans, of course, were in the epicenter. Healthy animals were chosen for this purpose. The livestock of local villages, cows, sheep, horses, settled near the explosion. After the test, there was virtually nothing left of them. Those animals that were a little further away were blinded. The Soviet commanders first wanted to find out if the troops could get through the nuclear explosion while still being able to fight. No one thought about the delayed consequences of participating in such an experiment. In addition, no one observed the irradiated people afterwards. They were not allowed to be told about the experiment at all. The tests took place on the 14th of September 1954. The main experimental element was an atomic bomb RDS-2. It had a power of 44 kilotons. At the test site were sent 45,000 military, 600 tanks and SAU, the same number of armored personnel carriers, and 320 aeroplanes, 500 mortars and guns, and a large number of cars and tractors. The experiment involved not only servicemen, who were mostly conscripts, but also freelance girls and doctors. There were many villages around the range, and, naturally, the civilian population was also exposed to danger. The locals were used to the fact that there were always some kinds of exercises at the test site, but no one had warned them that nuclear tests would be conducted. The whole territory around the test site, within a radius of 50 kilometers, was divided into several zones. Within 8 kilometers, the local population was evacuated. Those who lived within 12 kilometers of the test site, 3 hours before the test, had to leave their homes and move to natural shelters. And 10 minutes before the explosion occurred, they had to lie face down on the ground. People living within a radius of 15 kilometers had to leave their homes and other structures 1 hour before the explosion. 10 minutes before the explosion, they would also lie down on the ground. Those living within a radius of 50 kilometers did not do much. Special measures were to be taken only if there would be heavy radioactive contamination of the area. The last, Zone 5, was located along the route of the aircraft that dropped the bomb. In doing so, the aircraft had an open bomb bay. The population that lived in this area was moved to a safe area 3 hours before the experiment, and livestock was closed in barns. The atomic bomb was dropped from a Tu-4 aircraft at 0934. It was dropped from an altitude of 8,000 meters. 48 seconds later, there was an explosion. One of the military eyewitnesses recalled that to the epicenter of the explosion, columns of equipment were lined up from 3 sides to a depth of up to 5 kilometers. That equipment, which was located within 1,000 kilometers from the epicenter of the explosion, was pressed into the ground and all melted. All the existing forest was burnt out. The territory, which was not in the epicenter itself, also lost trees, but stumps remained. Then the trunks were preserved, and only then the trees that had burnt tops. 5 minutes after the explosion, an artillery preparation began, and the aviation began a bombing attack. Some planes that were supposed to hit ground targets crossed the stem of the atomic mushroom just 20 minutes after the explosion took place. Radar reconnaissance went to the epicenter of the explosion 40 minutes later. Most of the participants in this experiment were exposed to high levels of radiation. Residential buildings that were located within a 25-kilometer radius of the explosion were severely damaged. Some had windows completely blown out, while others had only cracked windows. 2 villages that were too close to the epicenter were completely burnt out. From the protective elements, the participants of the experiment had only a gas mask and a Macintosh. On the 17th of September, it was announced that the tests had been successful. But nobody thought about those who were in the very epicenter of radioactive exposure. No decontamination measures were carried out. The conscripts finished their service in the same uniforms they wore at the test site. All participants signed a non-disclosure agreement. It was valid for 25 years. And even if they developed serious illnesses against the background of radioactive radiation, they had no right to tell doctors what happened to them. It became known about the tests at the Totsk test site only in the late 1980s. Then it turned out that not only military men were affected. Some planes that were supposed to hit ground targets crossed the stem of the atomic mushroom just 20 minutes after the explosion took place. Radar reconnaissance went to the epicenter of the explosion 40 minutes later. Most of the participants in this experiment were exposed to high levels of radiation. Residential buildings that were located within a 25-kilometer radius of the explosion were severely damaged. Some had windows completely blown out, while others had only cracked windows. Residents who returned saw their houses burnt and destroyed. Livestock and pets were blinded. Such animals were immediately taken away by soldiers. The returning peasants repaired broken walls, floors, and windows. Those who were left homeless were taken in by neighbors. And then all the inhabitants in the affected area slaughtered and ate the meat of cattle that had been exposed to radiation. Sheep wool was collected from the burnt-out landfill, which was then used for spinning and knitting clothes, and the affected trees were used as firewood. Water was also taken from local wells. The next year there were a lot of mushrooms and berries in the local forests. Only the next year, many people found themselves with signs of serious illnesses. And then doctors diagnosed them with cancer. Participants of the experiment died of anemia, liver disease, kidney disease. Women gave birth to sick children. Even young people had many serious illnesses. Leonid Pogrebnoy was studying the effect of radiation on animals. He, together with his team, selected animals at the polygon, which more or less survived. These animals were sent to Moscow for research. In total, the brigade consisted of 9 people. And after the research, only one Pogrebnoy survived. But after that, he began to have terrible headaches. They were later diagnosed in his children as well. The Soviet leadership did not believe that anything had been done incorrectly. The leaders were confident that the security measures that had been taken at the training ground were sufficient. After all, the soldiers did not enter the epicenter of the explosion. At that moment, they were 7.5 kilometers away, and in the trenches. In addition to trench coats and gas masks, they had stockings and gloves as protective equipment, and the tanks available on the range, thanks to their armor, reduced the radiation level by 5 times. 6 hours later, the equipment was decontaminated. All of it was washed. The soldiers went through the appropriate treatment, changed their clothes. The radioactive cloud moved in the direction where no civilians lived. In the 90s, there were studies on the radiation level in the territory of the test site, and the results showed that the radiation level was equal to the natural background. But those were official reports, and the real results remain completely unknown. In 1991, the Supreme Soviet of the USSR recognized the participants of this experiment as veterans of special risk units. They were granted appropriate benefits. In 1994, a memorial dedicated to the participants of the Snowball experiment was erected at the test site. The arms race demanded that appropriate measures be taken. The Soviet Union needed to eliminate the backlog of its armed forces in terms of nuclear weapons. There were periodic provocations from the West, and it was necessary to create this type of weapon to defend their country.